Wow class, it's already week 5. In this video, I will cover two topics. One, how to quote, and two, how to use the method. You'll need both of these topics, or more appropriately, these skills, in order to be able to complete the second Martin Luther King summary. That second summary is going to be more targeted, so you're going to say more about less. It's going to be more analytical, and you're going to incorporate some quotes. So let's begin with the first part. You've already learned something about quoting, paraphrasing, and summarizing. Let's talk in more depth about quoting. First of all, there are two types of quotes. They are called in-text quotes and block quotes. You use in-text quotes for any quote that's the original that you pull out of another document that is less than 4 lines long, and it's going to be 4 lines in your own paper. I should say less than or equal to 4 lines long. Block quotes are going to be for quotes that are more than 4 lines long. So let's talk about in-text quotes. This is what an in-text quote looks like. Let's imagine that you're quoting from an online source that doesn't have page numbers. You would make it look something like this. McCain used, quote, and use of quotation marks, chicanery and fallacious emotional appeals, ellipses, those ellipses mean that something's cut out, and we'll talk about that later, to manipulate and deceive the Americans into changing their minds, unquote. Notice that the quote, after the quote, includes who said the quote. It should also include a period. Or a better way to do this is go ahead and include the source, the last name of the person who you borrowed the quote from, right up front. This is the according to so-and-so way of quoting. So another way you could say, use a quote is, Eliot contends that McCain used, quote, chicanery and fallacious emotional appeals to manipulate and deceive the Americans into changing their minds, unquote. Notice that at the end of the quote, the period appears inside the quotation marks for this one where you don't have the source listed. Notice in this first one, where you do have the source name listed in parentheses at the end, the quotation marks end at the end of the quote, and the period goes on the outside of both the quotation marks and your citation. The way I tell other students to remember this is that the period, the citation is part of your sentence but not part of the quote. Therefore, it needs to go outside the quotation marks but inside your sentence. Okay, so this is what it looks like if you have a source without page numbers. If you have a source with page numbers, it's going to look like this. Notice that the only change is you include the page number in the parentheses for the citation, once again, period, or you just include the page number at the end. We'll go into more detail about using citations and page numbers when we get to using MLA, but for right now, this is what you need to know. So let's talk about block quotes. This is how a block quote looks. It looks substantially different than an in-text quote, and it's used for a much longer kind of quotation. So I'll read this off. The original student's writing is, many Americans are more comfortable with electing a president who looks like our past presidents. By the way, this comes from an actual student paper that I got some time ago. Marcus Mulitsas, who runs the Daily Cost block, states, notice it's just a comma. Anytime that you say argues, states, says, and so on, you just need a comma, and then goes right into the quote. Notice that the quote is indented. The entire quote is indented here. And notice what's missing. There are no quotation marks at the beginning or end of the quote. The indenting is the signal for a quote. You do not need to use quotation marks when you indent. In fact, you should not use quotation marks when you indent. Also notice another slight change, one that I'm not going to expect you to remember because it's a lot of details. But notice that when you use a block quote, for some reason, now the period moves from outside of the number to on the other side of the number. That's one of those crazy rules I talked about last week. Okay, and then notice when you're done with the quote, you just go right back to the regular left indent and continue talking about the quote. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more, but let me show you how you actually create this block quote. Because if you just do tab or hit spaces, you're going to cause a lot of problems for yourself. If you have to go through and change a quote, it's going to get all screwed up. Some of you are probably nodding your heads, remembering a time that happened to you. So let me show you in Google Docs or how to do that. Here is a blank Google Docs. Notice that at the top I have a ruler. I can do a lot of things in this ruler. I can set tabs, I can change my margins, but this really odd looking thing here, which includes a rectangle over a down arrow, these control, notice, my first line indent and my left indent. Okay, if I wanted to change the first line indent, I would highlight just first line indent and move it. If I want to move the whole thing, I go to the left indent. So let's just say I'm writing, let's write a paragraph here. Oops. No. Okay, come on. There you go, left indent. Now, anyway, let me just show you how to create the quote. So I'm just writing along, blah, 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 making my argument, blah, blah, blah. This is my claim, and then I want to include the quote, right? So and so states, comma, and then I hit enter. Then I change my margin. The MLA standard is 1-inch indent for a quote. And then I go ahead and write the quote. Now watch what happens here. While I write the quote, it sticks with where I set that margin or that indent. When I'm done with the quote, I hit enter again. Oops, well, let's do this. Page number 8. When I'm done with the quote, I go ahead and put my indent back to where it was, and I can continue writing. Okay, and therefore, if I need to go through and change this quote, like, oops, I typed that wrong, I can go ahead and delete it, and it doesn't change my margins at all. Okay, so remember with block quotes, this, I don't know why I have this slide in here, just page numbers, you include the 25 after the period. Okay, now remember earlier I showed you those ellipses. Ellipses are in there to indicate to my reader that I have changed a quote. You do not use ellipses at the beginning or an end of a quote. Let me say that again. You do not use ellipses at the beginning or an end of a quote because the quotation marks stand in for you've removed that material from something else. So you do not need them in the middle. You use the ellipses in the middle to show material that you've taken out. So why might you do that? There's really only two reasons why you would change a quote. One, you're going to remove material that is excessive or unimportant for your purposes. Remember, quotes we use for short bunches of information. So you don't want to burden your reader by having a hugely long quote in there, particularly if the middle part is just doesn't fit your argument. It doesn't really have anything to do with what you're talking about. So it makes sense to remove it for your readers so that they don't have to look at it and you don't have to talk about it. Because if you're going to quote, you have to talk about the quote, and we're going to get to that here in a second. So if you do remove material that is excessive or unimportant for your purposes, remember, first of all, do not change the meaning. This is very important. Make sure that you don't take out a word that utterly changes the meaning. I've seen, for example, students take out the word not and utterly changing the sentence. I actually give you a real-world example. When I was in high school, I was on a cross-country team, and we were interviewed by the newspaper, and the reporter asked, are you guys arrogant? And I remember the captain of our team says, no, we are not arrogant. And the quote appeared in the paper, we are ... arrogant. That's pretty unethical, and I don't want you to do that, okay? Second, use ellipses to indicate material that you removed from the quote. Ellipses is just dot, space, dot, space, dot, space. So use 3 ellipses to indicate material taken out within a sentence. So you're taking out material inside a sentence. Now, if you take out more material, so say you're taking out material between 2 sentences, or you've taken out an entire sentence within a paragraph, you're going to use 4 ellipses to indicate 2 joined sentences. Simple way to remember this. If there's a period anywhere in the material that you've taken out, change it from 3 to 4 ellipses. Now, the second reason why you might change a quote is to match the grammatical sense of your paper. even though it's a quote from somebody else, the grammar has to stay the same. So if you're in present tense, the quote should be in present tense. If you're in past tense, the quote should be in past tense. If you are using third person, he, she, or it voice while you're writing your paper, the quote should be in that. So you may, it doesn't happen very often, but you may need to change the quote to fit your narration. If you do that, you're going to use brackets to indicate any changes that you've made in the words. So let me show you an example of that. Okay, here's the original. You've seen this from earlier. A lot of people want to cling to the comfortable world that they have always lived in. The Obamas don't look like what first families have always looked like. This will be one of the factors in the fall because a lot of people simply want to stick with what they've known in their past. Okay, here's the altered version to reflect time. During the last election, Mark Mullitsas argued that Obama would not win the election because of deep-seated racism. Now notice I'm talking about the past. So in the past, he argued that 4 years ago, a lot of people wanted to cling to the comfortable world that they had always lived in. Dot, 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 dot. Now remember, this indicates that I've taken out material. I've taken out from lived in all the way down to because. And notice that there's a period that appears in there, so I have to have 4 ellipses. So because they, and what I've done here is I've taken out the whole lot of people. It just seemed excessive. It's not important because they simply wanted to stick with what they had known in the past. Okay. Another reason that people put in brackets is sometimes when you quote, if it's got a pronoun in it like he, she, or it, when you throw the quote into your own writing, it's going to be confusing to your reader because they don't know what the noun is. So sometimes people use brackets to put the noun back in. Like say, this quote from Mark Mullitsas said he, referring to Obama. If you just quote it, it's going to be confusing. So you might actually take out the he and put Obama in brackets. Okay, so this is about how the technical aspect of putting quotes into a paper. Let's talk about something far more important, and that's called framing quotes. When you put a quote into your paper, a quote cannot stand by itself. It is evidence. We're going to talk about evidence more when we get to chapter 7, but the point is it's evidence of something that you've said in your paper, which means that no quote can stand by itself because it has to back up something that you're saying. It's also important that you have to integrate a quote into your text. You're going to do this by framing the quote with your own words. Briefly, you do this by introducing the quote, and then after you've quoted, making it clear to your reader why you're including the quote. My kind of color-coded chart for this is what a framing of a quote should look like. First, should be some argument from you, something that you're trying to say, that you're using the quote to back up, to argue with, whatever reason that you might be bringing the quote into your paper. You have to introduce the quote. It's important that your reader knows who's saying the quote and where the quote's coming from. After you've quoted, you need to explain to your reader what the quote means. So this is going to be a paraphrase, right? A simple, here's what I believe the quote says. Next, you need to explain to your reader why you picked the quote. Remember, you started with an argument here. So if you've used the quote, don't assume that your reader can understand why you picked the quote. It is your job to explain to them what the quote means and why you picked it. Okay, so that's the next part. And then finally, you're going to conclude and transition to the next point. Let me show you an example of what this looks like using The Big Shaggy. Remember that David Brooks reading that I gave you at the very beginning of the semester. Here is my summary of what it means using a quote from David Brooks. And this is the same color-coded model that I've used before. Notice it is framed. The yellow is my frame, kind of like a frame around a picture. And the green represents my introduction, blue represents my paraphrase, purple represents my kind of discussion of why it matters. So the whole thing goes like this. Of course, David Brooks argues that studying the humanities can make us better readers and writers, but he thinks that it helps us develop a far more important and more elusive skill, understanding human nature. Brooks calls this the Big Shaggy. As he explains, quote, over the past century or so, people have built various systems to help them understand human behavior. but none completely explain behavior because deep down people have passions and drives that don't lend themselves to systemic modeling. Notice I've cut something out here, and obviously I've cut out a sentence. According to Brooks, human beings are fundamentally irrational creatures who act in irrational ways, and no scientific or social model, no matter how sophisticated, can fully capture why we act the way we do. The Big Shaggy is his term for all the yearnings and fears. Notice I've used a quote in my paraphrase. Um, Yearnings and fears that interrupt any rational way of acting. He says that for centuries, humans have investigated the Big Shaggy through art, music, sculpture, and literature. These artists have wrestled with why we act the way we do for far longer than scientists have been studying the human brain and give us insight into ourselves and others. Therefore, studying the humanities gives us access to the Big Shaggy in ways that science and math courses cannot. So, this is a useful way of framing an entire quote. Why should you care? Well, for those of you who are interested in just getting the work done and moving on, notice that this whole thing is 205 words long. What that means is if I'm trying to if I have to write, let's say, a 500-page paper on something, I'm close to halfway there. So notice that one way that you can lengthen a paper is by including quotes properly. If you throw a quote in and make sure that you frame it, you're going to help yourself get to the page length. And you're going to help yourself get to your page length in a useful way that I and other instructors are going to smile upon. Aha, you're backing up your ideas with somebody else's ideas. You're showing yourself in conversation with other people. That concludes the first part of the lesson. Let's move on to the second, the method. Okay, quick review of part of the chapter is the method includes finding repetitions, which are going to be any words that are the exact same word repeated, and that includes different parts of speech like running, run, ran. Strands, which are going to be repeated ideas, concepts, or similar kinds of words, not the exact same kind of word. After finding repetition strands, then we try to identify binaries that we see at work in the text, which finding repetition strands will help us find the binaries. Once we've completed that, we're going to rank the data. Once we've completed that, then we're going to look for anomalies. And remember that anomalies are anything that doesn't fit not only what you see going on in the text, but doesn't fit whatever argument that you've come up for the text at that point. Finding anomalies will help you make your point of view more interesting or complex. So real quickly, since I've taken up enough of your time with this video so far, we're going to look again at Out There by Truman Capote. In this case, I want to look at the second paragraph. Now, in looking at the second paragraph, I'm going to start by looking for repetitions. What I've done here is I've gone through and bolded the words that are repeated. We see that we've got seen and see, buildings, building, sign, sign, dance, dancing, bank, bank, apartments, apartment. Okay, these are the repetitions that we have. And if you were following the method as it calls for in the book, you'd write this down. I see the word see repeated twice, building twice, dance twice, sign times 2, apartment times 2, bank times 2. So that's the first step, finding the repetitions. That's pretty easy. Next, we want to go through and find the strands. So I've gone through and marked up this paragraph in different colors for the strands that I see. First of all, just going, well, not in order, but starting with blue, notice that in addition to buildings and building, I see other words that are very similar. Buildings, structure, building, bank, bank, apartments, apartment houses, mansion, and homes. There is definitely a strand of buildings or structures running through this text. Interestingly, there's also these kinds of words that are repeated throughout the text. Aimless, haphazard, unnamed, unpaved, irrelevant, ramshackle. These words seem to have something in common. We'll talk about that on the next page. I also see a strand of dirt and dirty from the brown stretch of the Arkansas. That's how it's pronounced there, at least. Dust, mud, and flaking. I also see a repetition of failure, as in ceased, dark, and failed. And just like I did with the repetitions, I'm now going to write down my strands. Notice that it's a longer list than the other one I had. Now you don't have to actually identify them, names for these strands while you're going through, but when you write them down, once you've written down the list of words that go together, you want to come up with some title. But I got structures, dirty, and failure. Those were pretty easy. But these words, they all have something in common, but I'm not exactly sure at first what that is. I'm going to, for the purposes here, name that lack of structure. Okay, oops. And it doesn't matter, I was going to underline it, but you get the idea. Okay, so once I found my strand, now notice how much easier this is in order to find binaries. Right off the bat, there are three binaries I see working in here. Structure versus lack of structure. Pretty interesting. Success versus failure, dirty versus clean. Now you see on this page I've already moved on to the next step, which is ranking them. You can rank them in any order you want, for whatever reason that you want. You may pick something that seems rather insignificant and not the main point in the text, but you find it particularly interesting or strange, so you want to talk about that one. In this particular case, I rank structure versus lack of structure 1, because first of all, I find it particularly interesting because it's surprising given what the first paragraph is about. If you remember the dusty plains, the whole cowboy theme. I also put it number 1 because it actually covers most of the paragraph. Structure versus lack of structure seems to be an important controlling binary in the whole paragraph, given how many words are given over to that binary. Success versus failure seems like another important one. It seems to relate in some way to number 1. That's why I put it number 2. And then dirty versus clean, I see it going on, but there's very few words and it just doesn't seem as important to me. So if I were to write something based on doing the method, I would probably focus here on the structure versus lack of structure. Take us to our next step, anomalies, right? Remember, anomalies is something that doesn't fit what you have found already in the text. So going back and looking at our marked version of the second paragraph, something I notice now, once I'm done, that doesn't fit is like this sentence right here, or this whole thing, bounded on the south by a brown stretch of the Arkansas River, on the north by a highway, Route 50, and on the east-west by prairie lands and wheat fields. Oh, I noticed there's something going on here with highways, streets. I missed that the first time. And to add to that, I also noticed that there's a mentioning of railroad up here and river. So obviously there's something else going in here having to do with travel. But it's interesting how Truman Capote mentioned this. It's not just travel. Notice he talks about them as lines on a map. Bounded. These are boundaries. The railroad, the highway, the river all act as boundaries. And I didn't talk about boundaries the first time. This would be an anomaly. This would add to what I've already found. I also noticed at the bottom that there's something going on here with teaching, right? We've got the faculty, the teacherage, and so on. So this gives me my anomalies, boundaries. He talks about, uses the word bounded, north, east, and west. There's also some kind of strand of travel, rivers, roads, railroads, highways, routes, so on. There's also something going on with teachers and teaching. Now, this last one, teachers and teaching, doesn't seem that important. It also becomes the major theme of the next, or 2 paragraphs on in his description. But these two can add really interestingly to the original theme that I was interested in, structure and lack of structure. So if I had to write a paragraph about what I've learned from doing the method, I might write this. This paragraph represents the breakdown of social structures, such as the town. I mean, the town itself is a social structure. People put it together, they live in there, they live by the rules, and so on. Those structures provide direction, there's my theme of direction, and boundaries, my theme of boundaries. But over time, they have fallen into disrepair, and there is my theme of lack of structure as well as failure, and can no longer protect us from extreme behavior such as murder. Notice that this paragraph, therefore, interestingly foreshadows where the whole story is going. It is headed towards a murder and how this murder causes a breakdown of the town. And we can see all of that kind of prefigured for us in the way that Truman Capote uses language in this paragraph. Okay, so that completes my instruction on quoting and the method. Now your job is to go through and use the method on Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail in order to gain a greater insight into what's going on in his text. Good luck.